So thank you, and good afternoon. Really, thank you all for being here. I think this is not a testament to the MacArthur Foundation at all. This is a testament to the critical nature of the issue for our city at this time. Now, clearly, I'm not Bob Gallucci, and I'm sorry, but his 5-year term at the MacArthur Foundation will end on July 1st, and I will step into the seat, the chair, the saddle, I'm not sure what, and thank you, and pave the way for a new generation, a new perspective of leadership at the foundation. Now, Bob did a terrific job as head of the foundation, but one of the things he did when he joined us 5 years ago, he said, we got to get it right in Chicago. And as he is leaving, he says, we got to make sure that Chicago stays in the forefront of what we care about and what we invest in. So I just want to remind you, because it's really funny, whenever there's a leadership change, at a foundation or anywhere, there's always the concern that priorities will shift. And I have to say that in the 36 years that MacArthur has been in Chicago, the priorities for Chicago have not shifted at all. As a matter of fact, in that time, our investments have exceeded $1.1 billion to 1,100 organizations, including even most recently $200 million in community and economic development in Chicago neighborhoods, opportunities for individuals, reducing and preventing youth violence. Now, I don't say this in a bragging way, but it really makes me proud that we are probably the largest single private supporter of arts in Chicago. That's more than $9 million each year to more than 200 arts and culture groups. So the real bottom line is that Chicago is our home and Chicago is our headquarters city. So while MacArthur is undergoing a leadership transition, as a matter of fact, it actually sort of bummed me out to think that this would actually be the third president in my own tenure. I don't know how much more I could take of that, but the commitment throughout that period to Chicago is unshakable. So I think that's what makes today's topic really front and center. And so this idea that we are grappling as a society, as a community, as individuals with violence, makes it important that we constantly get together and seek solutions together. So that's what we hope that this panel today will contribute to. Now, for every other foundation active here, the Fearless Joyce Foundation out there on gun issues when no one else, where we all fear to tread, actually, the McCormick Foundation, the Chicago Community Trust, Fry, Field, Polk, all the corporate funders for Get In Chicago and others. This is a critical topic, and it's really a continuing focus of our investment. When you look across everybody's portfolios, what we are funding addresses all the pieces of a solution set. Youth engagement, community organizing, suppression of violence through interrupters, research, support for new law enforcement approaches, efforts around guns, new promising approaches to help young people step back from confrontation, and then most importantly, for the organizations that are out there every day on the front line. So the shared goal of everyone is to find out what works to prevent and reduce violence, constantly, though, with the understanding that no single intervention will solve the problem. So just quickly, some of the things that we have funded that will probably be mentioned in the panel today include the youth guidance program, Becoming a Man. This was actually part of the inspiration for President Obama's launch of My Brother's Keeper initiative. The Chicago Police Department's violence reduction strategy, which focuses on gang violence reduction through peer pressure. University of Chicago Crime Lab, scientific evidence about the effectiveness and impact of different strategies. And a $5 million pledge to evaluate the interventions supported by Get In Chicago. And of course, our historic support for suppression through organizations like Ceasefire and its important violence interrupters. Now, people involved in some of these projects will join me here, but keep in mind that this panel of 4 people, it's only 4 of the many, many who are dedicated to the city's shared goal. I mean, to wit, even the recent announcement by the U.S. Attorney of his commitment, the commitment of his office. And of course, I'm glad I don't work for a mayor anymore, because I'm sure that this is the number one issue every day when Mayor Emanuel walks into his office. But all of that brings us to our panel today. Now, from a peak of 900 homicides in the city in the early 90s, we've seen a reported low last year of 415. However, while we're aware that this is progress over decades and year over year, violence in parts of the city still makes the city a violent place compared to its peers. And the perception of violence is just as toxic for the day-to-day quality of life and for human potential and for our competitiveness as a city. So whatever improvements are made, I can't imagine that there's even one person in this room who would argue that we can or should accept this level of violence in the city. Today, we want to explore the history, the characteristics of Chicago's problem, and most importantly, what's being done and what can be done to combat it. So while I'm introducing the panelists, can I invite them to join me at the podium here? So first of all, it's Commissioner Evelyn Diaz of the City of Chicago Department of Family and Support Services. With her $400 million budget in supportive services, she includes important programs to curb youth violence. Dr. Toni Irving, Executive Director of Chicago's Public Safety Action Committee, Get in Chicago, is heading up Chicago's $50 million public-private partnership to invest in programs to help at-risk youth. Now, Professor Andrew Papachristos, he's a Yale University professor. He focuses his research on the social networks of violence, and he recently authored a report regarding the last 48 years of violence levels in Chicago. And finally, Professor Jens Ludwig, University of Chicago professor and director of University of Chicago Crime Lab. So starting at this very precise moment when I sit down, I'm going to dispense with titles because I decided that I could only say Professor Papachristos once. And so let me transition over here and let's dive into the conversation.
So thank you, everybody. Hello. Thanks, everybody, for having me. Professor Papachristos, I could open a pizza place with that sort of title and get even a little bit more alliteration. So one thing they asked me to speak on first was sort of this history of Chicago. And I hate to pick on a previous speaker, but this idea that we're worse off than we were since the beer wars is actually wrong. It's actually decidedly wrong, and it's actually dangerously wrong for lots of the reasons that were just mentioned. But I just finished a report. It's part of a larger project about crime trends. I want to ask why we should care about crime trends, and I'll kind of move to the findings. So I realized in a project I'm on that this is the 30-year anniversary of the shooting of Benji Wilson. You remember Benji Wilson? Remember Yummy Sandifer? Dantrell Davis? Right. I could go back to Alvin Palmer. Does anybody remember Alvin Palmer, 57? Okay? Every one of those murders sparked this fear and these discussions that we're having today, but they happen at very unique historical moments. It's part of the reason we should care about where we are. So one of the things I've looked at is this historical crime patterns in the city of Chicago, and there are a couple of things. We're actually at the lowest level of recorded homicides since '67, okay? There's not continuous data to go back to the beer wars, but the rates are significantly lower. I want to reiterate, it doesn't mean people feel safer. There's not work to be done, or in fact that we're not a violent city. We're actually not the murder capital by any counting. We have, and I can talk about that for 45 minutes, but if I tell you somebody weighs 200 pounds, you want to ask yourself whether they're 5 feet tall or 6 feet tall before you tell me their BMI, right? It's one of those things we need to keep in mind. So we're actually at one of the lowest recorded levels of violent crime and homicide in a really long time. However, there are a couple important things that are happening as crime is going down. The first thing that's happening is we're getting a crime gap between the lowest and the highest crime neighborhoods. And that's one of the most pressing problems facing our city right now. What do we do to close the gap? Now, let me be a sociologist and then I'll stop. We have a lot of gaps in our society right now. Inequality in general, we talk about a lot in this country around income, around access to health care, around all the issues that many in this room care about. The gap between the lowest and the highest crime neighborhood is where we need to focus on. Nobody wants to go back to the levels of violence when Benji Wilson was murdered. No community does. But some communities in this city have rates that are exponentially higher, and that gap is stubborn, it's persistent, and it's one of the things we need to work on. The other important change which this report highlights is in the nature of violence. Even compared to the 1990s, gang violence is a bigger share of our total today, however we define it, whatever definition you want to use. The victim and perpetrator in these violent crimes are more likely today to be a member of a gang, and the disputes are different. What they're fighting about are slightly different. Some things are always the same, but the nature of the disputes have changed. It means a lot for how we approach violence, right? A family feud is different than warring nations, and those are things we have to consider as we think about this gap and where the sort of direction of these trends are heading. And the last thing I'll say, and this is just my own political sidebars, we start counting on January 1st, right? There's no armistice on December 31st, right? But we start the clock over on January 1st, and the murder on January 1st and December 31st means just as much to the family. It's just as damaging. And we need to count things, to be sure, but we need to also put them in perspective for everyone's sake. So I'll stop there. That was sort of the points I was asked to start with. So.
Okay, thank you so much. Let's go to Jens. You know, Jens, you're based in Chicago, but you do work nationally. So what aspects of the Chicago experience defines it compared to other places around the country?
So as Andy just mentioned, the homicide rate per capita in Chicago is about middle of the pack for big cities in the United States. For those of us who live in Chicago, we unfortunately know what it means to be middle of the pack. We know what this problem looks like in American cities. I live in Hyde Park. The homicide rate is well below the national average there. I walk 50 feet in any direction from my house. I get to Woodlawn. I get to Washington Park. I see homicide rates that are like what you would see in El Salvador, one of the world's most dangerous developing countries. One thing that is very common in Chicago that we see in all cities is the violence problem is so disproportionately concentrated in the most economically and racially segregated neighborhoods. And the most distressed neighborhoods in Chicago are among the most distressed neighborhoods in the entire country. You know, you see that in places like Baltimore and Detroit, but you don't have neighborhoods quite like that in cities like Los Angeles and New York. I think related to that, we have a gang problem in Chicago that is completely off the charts, maybe second only to Los Angeles or maybe ahead of Los Angeles, depending on how you try and measure this. And I think that creates, unfortunately, a lot of particularly challenging problems that we face in trying to make progress on this issue. And then I think the third thing that is really important to keep in mind for the Chicago context. I'm sure all of you read the newspaper headlines with the same reaction that I did a week or two ago about the shooting that happened maybe a mile or two west of my house in Hyde Park on Garfield Boulevard, where these two 14-year-old girls are in a fist fight over some Facebook argument about a boy. And then one of the girls' uncles brings a gun to the scene, and you turn a fist fight into a homicide. The girl was pronounced dead at Comer Children's Hospital right across the street from my house. I think the gun problem in Chicago and the number of guns on the street is particularly important. And that seems, for reasons that I think we don't totally understand, seems to be a particularly severe problem in Chicago compared to places like New York City and Los Angeles. And so the data that we've looked at the University of Chicago Crime Lab show that the number of guns per capita that CPD takes off the street every year is dramatically higher than what you see in New York and Los Angeles. And I think anything that we could do to turn these homicides back into fistfights would have transformative impacts in some of the most distressed neighborhoods in the city.
So, Evelyn, let me ask you, given this notion that maybe gangs are so deeply embedded into many of the South and West Side neighborhoods, what are some of the things that you are funding that, from the city's perspective, have some potential?
All right, so let me just start out by saying I need to start out by saying that what we do in my department is just one part of a large number of strategies that the city is pursuing to reduce violence. So in addition to what the Chicago Police is doing around data and predictive analytics that Andy Papachristos works on, in addition to what Chicago Public Schools has been doing, and a lot of people don't know this, but they have been on fire for the past couple of years doing expanding safe passage, expanding gang school safety teams. They've been reforming their disciplinary policy. Lots of different initiatives going on at Chicago Public Schools that have resulted in very impressive outcomes in terms of the number of CPS students who are being arrested and shot. The mayor just passed a juvenile expungement bill through the General Assembly. We did a huge and successful Faith in Action where we had 200 community actions on Memorial Day weekend and 42 hours of no shooting immediately following that. So we're doing so much more to try to help communities take action locally. So all of that is happening, and much, much more is happening. And in that context, my department has been charged with starting to shift resources toward programs that are going to help the crises that are facing our young people, and those specifically are high violence, high unemployment, and high dropout rates. And when I came in with the Emanuel administration in May of 2011, I took a look. One of the most glaring things I noticed in the department, and my department is responsible for everything from early childhood to senior, 7 different divisions. But in youth services in particular, we spend $30 million a year on youth programs. Those are after-school programs and summer job programs. And the first thing I noticed is that we couldn't tell whether that annual spend was moving the needle on any one of the crises facing young people, any one of the violence, high dropout rates, and unemployment. And so that is what we set out to do, is start figuring out how to do that. We ended programs that weren't showing good outcomes. We got rid of delegate agencies that were underperforming for years, and we put those resources instead, as well as millions of new dollars that we got from Mayor Emanuel and his investments in youth, and started designing and rigorously testing new programs designed to reduce violence. And so that's what we're doing. We're testing, we're investing in programs and seeing what works to reduce violence with different segments of youth, with different kinds of profiles in different parts of the city. So that's what we've been doing in my department.
So one of the things that distinguishes Chicago in conversations I have all over the country is how dedicated the corporate leadership is to focusing on social problems. So the Get In Chicago endeavor is really an expression of both passion and resources from the corporate sector. So Toni, talk a little bit about Get In Chicago. What do you hope to learn from that? And when do you think you'll see some results? And what does that tell you do in the future? Because I can't imagine, no one has said this, but I can't imagine that $50 million is all that our corporate sector will come up with over time if we start to see some good stuff.
I'm laughing, looking over at the table of a bunch of my donors, who I'm happy to see. But you know, I think that one of the things that Andrew and Evelyn and Jens all sort of did to start off, and I think is important to note, is to really contextualize the violence that's been taking place in the city of Chicago, that there's so much more going on than just people shooting. And so we're talking about communities that have overwhelmingly been lacking economic initiatives. They don't have anchor institutions. The employment situation is bad. The school situation is bad. And then you also have conditions that have structured individuals. So yesterday I was at a juvenile justice conference, and we had a young man, Xavier Bay, and he was arrested when he was 13. He spent 13 years in prison. And he says that the issue started with him at home, that his problems began in the home before he even got out to the street into the gangs. So what you see us focusing on here at Get In Chicago is the whole person. And so overwhelmingly we know that the young people that come through the county detention center, that come through the state Illinois youth centers, are all overwhelmingly abused and neglected. They have mental health issues. They have parents who are formerly or currently incarcerated. And so what we're doing is we're really taking a step back and looking at both the risk and protective factors that enable people to avoid lives of violence. And a large part of that is really, I think the point that Evelyn made is that trying to understand what works. So few dollars have been available until now without the partnership of our corporate sponsors to take a deep dive into evaluating these processes. And so for Get in Chicago, in a big picture way, we are building a bridge between the system and the community, between the theories about evidence-based and the practices as they take place on the ground. And so we don't discount the knowledge that communities bring to these issues. And so right now in our first round, we have 11 organizations, and we'll be looking to see how what they do translates into impact as they've defined it for this first stage. And then it'll be a continuous improvement process as we have Chapin Hall and others looking at their capacity to see how it can be bolstered up. So one, I think it's an unprecedented partnership between major corporations, Aon, Exelon, Allstate. There's just Boeing. They're huge names that are in the room and thinking about issues that you wouldn't expect of them. Two, we have the added attention of the MacArthur Foundation that has pledged up to $5 million to actually support the evaluation. And then three, we're really focused on what works for which constituent group. At what risk level does a particular kind of intervention work best? At what dosage, for how long, et cetera?
So let me pick up on that a little bit, because what works, an understanding of what works is not only anecdotal that you see in the lives of kids, it actually also comes through formal evaluations. So Jens and then Andrew, talk a little bit about what you're learning from your recent evaluations.
I'm going to go first, Andy? Is that
Yeah, you can go.
So I think that one of the things that we're all trying to do with these evaluations is identify specific programs that are helpful. But I think more than that, we're trying to understand the essence of the problem so that we can think about, I think there are more than one way to skin a cat in addressing these problems once you understand what the nature of the issue is. And let me just give you one example of this. I think most of us come to the violence problem in American cities with a slightly off picture of what it really is from all of our media exposure. So you watch The Wire and you see Snoop Pearson and Chris Paltrow going out to do a hit against a rival drug gang on behalf of Marla Stansfeld. You think of it as being very premeditated, very much designed to further the instrumental ends of some drug-selling gang. In practice, the problem is much more frequently, it's like the two 14-year-old girls on Garfield Boulevard, and someone makes a terrible decision in the moment. I was in the juvenile detention center a few years ago when a staff member there said to us, he said, 20% of the kids in here have profound problems. If you let them out, they're going to do harmful things to other people. But the other 80%, this is the team leader saying to me, the other 80%, I always tell them, if I could give you back just 10 minutes of your lives, none of you would be here. And I think the work that the University of Chicago Crime Lab has been doing with youth guidance on the Becoming a Man program, I think one of the things that we have learned from that is that it is possible to help kids navigate those critical 10-minute windows. But once you recognize that the problem are these 10-minute windows rather than intrinsically bad kids, that opens the door to a variety of different strategies that get at the same thing. And so Superintendent McCarthy, who many of you probably saw, just got admitted to the hospital today. Let's hope he comes out, recovers quickly. Superintendent McCarthy spends all of his time trying to figure out how you put an officer in between a potential shooter and a potential victim during those critical 10-minute windows. Ceasefire spends a lot of time trying to think about how you put a violence interrupter in that 10-minute window. I think this goes back to what Julia said, is we can't be thinking that there's just going to be one thing that's going to solve the problem. And I think we're starting to make a lot of very encouraging progress on identifying what the portfolio of promising strategies would be.
All right, I have to cross off my Wire reference.
Clearly, it's a man's program.
Anyways, I actually want to start with two phrases. One is in terms of what I'm learning from doing research on violence and social networks, not social media, social networks, actually, who you hang out with and who you do risky things with, is I think the ability to focus can do two things. It can do less harm, which is instrumental, because we know about all the bad things that are related with mass incarceration today. We can also do more good. And so all the names I mentioned earlier, where I got the nods, those are actually atypical cases, which is why they strike us so to our core. A child, an innocent child, a walk to school, a basketball phenom, right? And it's one of those things where that's not the usual victim, as sort of Jens was saying. And in fact, the people who are most likely victims by all the traditional risk factors are young men with a criminal record, African American or Latinos, and from particular neighborhoods. So if I told you which neighborhoods had the highest crime rates, no one would be surprised, right? But then if I asked you to tell me who's going to get shot next, then you start to scratch your head. Unless you're a good cop, a good pastor, a good outreach worker, and then they can kind of have ideas. So a lot of the work that I've been involved with is actually trying to figure out how violence clusters, not just in geography, but in networks. And one of the things we're finding, this is true in not just Chicago, but in Boston, in Newark, in Oakland, in Cincinnati, in New Orleans, is this intensely small amount of people who are at immediate risk of getting shot today. In most of Chicago, and we did this for the whole city, is about 3 to 5% of the population, which is a lot, but you're talking about 170,000 individuals. But that's where 85% of the victims are, right? Which actually means these risk factors that place you at risk, all those sort of buckets that I just named, they take you to the doorstep of figuring out people's risk, but there's something else that's going on. Right? And part of what the research is showing, including sort of the stuff that Jens has just mentioned, is if we can figure out ways to focus our efforts. And by the way, those 3 to 5%, almost all of them are currently in the system in one way or another. DCFS, parole, probation, we can actually touch them, right? We know who they are. They're not unknown random people. We actually know who they are. And a lot of the efforts that we're working on are actually trying to figure out how can we reach those people, not just to reduce retaliation, which is one thing that sort of Jens talked about, but actually to reduce trauma, right? And to improve resilience of families and communities. And I think that's where a lot of work is going, not just in Chicago, but in this country, is we know that these more focused efforts can actually do more good, but also do less harm. And this is really important in Chicago, and this is my last point, for those of us that remember gang loitering laws. Right? For those of us that remember broad sweeping laws, what we can actually find out from the research is oftentimes very specific interventions can have just as dramatic as effect. Often in the short term, though, and that'll be probably another part of the discussion about short term versus long term sorts of effects.
So while we go to a couple of round robin with the panel questions, please make sure that you're writing down any questions, and I don't know what the mechanism is for picking them up, but okay, you have people, good. So that then we can also invite you into the conversation. So the first quick round-robin question is, from each of your special perspectives, what do you see as the biggest challenge in your work in combating this issue? Let's start with you, Evelyn.
Well, so I could talk about challenges, or we could think about them as opportunities that are also challenges. I'm gonna start with the gun issue, and this is not my issue. I'm not an expert on this, but I think it's really important for people to know because I've learned something new about it. But the biggest difference between New York City and Chicago, you've heard people say, is the number of illegal guns on our streets. And if we wanted to really focus in on one thing that could make a huge difference, it would be this gun thing. And we've heard the mayor talk about it, and we've heard I've probably heard Superintendent MacArthur talk about it 100 times. And I understand the words that are coming out of his mouth when he says illegal guns on the streets, we recuperate, 10 times, 11 times, many times more than New York. But I never really understood how that even works. How does trafficking work, and why is Chicago so different in terms of trafficking than New York? And last week, maybe the week before, the mayor's office put out a report that didn't get a whole lot of attention publicly. What got attention was the new rules that the city was was proposing in an ordinance to place on gun sales. But accompanying that news was a report that the mayor's office and the Chicago Police Department put out that is a fairly short report, 10 to 11 pages, that spells out exactly how this works, why Chicago is different. It's numbers, it's graphs, totally accessible, easy to read. I read it really quickly. And it really illuminated that we have a very serious problem that has solutions if people are paying attention to it and decide that we are going to take that on. And not just in Chicago, but in Cook County and in the state, and in Indiana and in the region. And I fear that people like to talk about programs and interventions at the community level, and we are doing that. We're doing that. We're pouring tons of money and time and bringing brilliant people like Andy and Jens around us to do all of that, and we're committed to that. But we could do all of that and then have more youth programs than New York and more community actions than New York. But we're not going to really solve this until we also take on this gun issue. And so I want to put that out there and encourage people, if you're serious about understanding really the totality of this issue and the complexity and what makes Chicago especially unique, I'm going to offer that you Google Tracing the Guns Chicago, download the report, and educate yourself on it. It's really illuminating.
So Toni, a couple of words, what is the biggest challenge from your perspective?
The biggest challenge, I think, is an extension of what Andrew talked about in terms of knowing who the young people are. We just don't have the capacity to take evidence-based programs to scale. Many of you will have read last week that the Gates Foundation is cutting back on the spending, on the gives that they've been doing. Over 75% of the organizations don't have operational revenues over $500,000. In order to have impact in any particular space, whether it's Austin or North Lawndale or Inglewood, we need to be able to reach a high fraction of individuals in that space. And so where are the services to deliver to those young people? One of the things that we're really discovering is that we have to do a great deal of work to help organizations go to scale and be in a place to have impact.
So I'm going to phrase this question that I'm going to ask Jens and Andrew. Actually, we were, those of us at the MacArthur Foundation, were sitting in the room with our board, and you know how members of boards are. They like to take complex problems and, boil them down to a single question and expect you to have the answer. So I'd like to share with you one of the questions that one of our board members asked. And he said, well, what would it take to make Chicago as safe as New York? And so that actually sort of ties in with a question here that one of the members here said, which is, what are New York and LA doing right that we're not doing? So let me ask this overly simple question. First,
Why doesn't Andy go first? That sounds much better.
But I think embedded in that question is not the big complex answer that we're talking about here, but it also says, can we figure out which of the things that all need to be done must be done first, must be done most, that may have the greatest leverage in making improvements in the other things. So Jens, you're on.
Yeah, let me, I could talk about some specific kind of programmatic or policy things, but let me step back and just very briefly mention two systemic things that I think might not occur to most of you. One of the things that New York has going for it is that it has a much larger share of the criminal justice system pieces all falling under one jurisdiction, which makes it much easier, requires a lot less energy and effort to coordinate the different pieces of the criminal justice system in that sort of environment compared to the more fragmented system that we have in Chicago. And I think that actually turns out to be not a trivial thing in getting alignment around some of these core problems, things like gun violence. The second thing that I wanted to mention is I think most of us have a sense that New York has some structural advantages, like having Wall Street and a lot of Wall Street money sloshing around that the city can rely on. And only recently did I start to look into what government spending levels look like in New York City compared to Chicago. And the difference there is striking. It's not just criminal justice spending, it is spending on social programs and everything. And I think what would it take to get the Chicago violence problem to look like New York's? It would either take us, we'd either have to figure out a way to generate more money, or we'd have to figure out a way to be unbelievably smart to spend the money that we actually have. And I think it's got to be one of those two things or a combination to do that.
Andrew.
I'll go first next time. I think I want to talk. Well, I'll finish by what we shouldn't do that New York did. But the obvious one is the gun issue, and I think a lot of it has to do with what Jens said, and really getting a handle on why we need local, federal, and state level types of laws. And New York's gun laws are, you know, when we talk about Chicago's gun laws, well, they have the strictest policy and the highest homicide rate. Everybody seems to forget the entire state of Louisiana, which is debating whether or not they should give felons back guns. And they forget New York. And I think it's one of those things that we really need to look at is the issue of guns. I'm going to throw the word gangs out there again. We can't turn back history. We can't redo the Prohibition era. We can't redo the 60s, but the relationship New York has had with gangs and how they dealt with gangs in the past was different. How they're dealing with them now is different. Do they have gangs? Yes. Did you see the huge gang that was just busted in their housing projects? Yes. How many of them they have and what they do are quite different. The relationships with the narcotic industry is also different. So I think trying to look and see how that relates to the way they approached it holistically is quite different. But I do want to say something, which is just me changing the question about what we shouldn't do. Because I think a lot of people are thinking of it. We actually don't want to have a police approach that the NYPD had. The NYPD's crime decline came at a really severe cost. The NYPD is vilified. And it's not clear that that's actually what drove crime down in New York, to be clear. One of the things that they did do, constitutionally or otherwise, was essentially very focused hotspot policing. And at least that's what some colleagues argue. But we don't actually know why crime went down in New York. We can't actually prove it, and that's what sort of I'm in the business in. But, you know, the gun issue is non-trivial, and I'll repeat that every chance I can get. The gang issue is non-trivial. But lastly, you know, thinking about approaches to policing, I don't want to be New York. If that's necessarily the case. And I'm actually proud of a lot of the new directions policing is heading in Chicago, and I think that actually is probably more promising. The last thing, of course, which I do think they did well, was also the issue of accountability and actually using information was something that NYP did early. And the relationship with data is another question altogether, but it actually is something that, you know, any other industry does. I have an annual evaluation, right? How many papers did you publish? All these sorts of things. I think it was something that was practiced in New York that was something that was quite useful. So those were my generic comments.
Let's turn to some of these terrific questions from the audience. Here's the one. Studies have shown that even short stays in jail or pretrial detention increases the risk of recidivism. For those charged with nonviolent offenses. It also decreases public safety. Where does keeping youth out of contact with the justice system come into play with violence reduction?
So this question comes at a really great time. Just yesterday, we launched a 2-year total overhaul of the Juvenile Intervention Support Center, which is a juvenile arrest processing facility right in the center of the city that handles any juvenile arrests that take place in the middle third of the city. We get about 9,000 kids that are arrests that are processed through that facility. And when we started to take a look at what we were doing in that facility with those young people, how many of those kids were being diverted from court and detention, we weren't happy with the ratio. And nor were we happy with, for those who got diverted, what they were getting. What were they being diverted to? What's the program? What's the intervention? So we completely overhauled it. We have a new risk tool that the Chicago Police Department detectives are going to be using to assess whether a youth is diverted. or not. We're also launching a new intervention that's going to be studied over a period of 2 years. We'll have 1,200 kids who are diverted participate in a 6-month intensive intervention, strong mentoring, and restorative justice as a part of that. That's being evaluated and set up as a randomized control trial evaluation over a 2-year period. We're doing that with the crime lab. And we've beefed up case management. So we're going to be testing whether what we've put into place here is actually going to help young people, first of all, divert more young people from the court system and detention. But then what happens to them is also important to us. We want to make sure that they never go back, they never get rearrested. And so we're putting some things into place. We'll be measuring to see whether those work. It's about the most exciting thing I have ever been a part of in city government. I'm happy to talk about the specifics about these interventions and what we did to create the intervention, all of the research that went into it, and national experts that came to inform the strategy. Happy to talk about it more, but we're really excited about what that's going to tell us about diversion.
So here's a question that takes us right into the future. It says Oakland, San Francisco, and New York City are considering the use of drones in the battle against crime. So apparently they are relatively inexpensive, and the technology, drones with high-resolution night vision cameras that could be used to, I don't even know where I'm going with this, but so would anybody like to? Andrew, would you like to?
That's retaliation, and we're trying to stop that, but thank you. I mean, really? Seriously? I mean, that's my first comment. I mean, I guess is, again, I think there's a lot of things we could do before drones that we probably should do. And it is one of those things where when you're trying to think about what it, so if we step back and talk about more serious types of criminal acts, organized crime, sort of trafficking, where actually maybe there is a use for drones following, shipments of narcotics or things around. I don't even know what to say, other than I probably could find better budget items for it. I mean, I just.
Not ready for.
Yeah, I'm not right. I don't even have an
Okay.
answer other than I actually
So
thought
let's
it was
go to
kind of a
something
joke.
that we,
Sorry.
that is in the realm of sort of immediate concern and possibilities. And that is, even though we've all touched on the prevalence of guns, we really haven't talked much about gun access. 3 sellers in the suburbs in Indiana, and, the new sort of constraints on potential gun sellers here. What are the whole array of proposed solutions that are within our sort of constitutional, envelope to take advantage of? Yeah.
So I think the, one of the very interesting recent developments was the city's plan for monitoring gun dealers. And I think it's a little bit hard to appreciate what that proposal means until you really understand how broken the federal approach to monitoring gun dealers actually is. So the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms right now is the frontline agency that's supposed to keep track of gun dealers and make sure they don't do things like illegally sell truckloads of guns out the back of their gun store without any paperwork to whoever. ATF is hamstrung both by legislation in terms of how often they can go visit gun dealers, and they're also hamstrung by budget considerations. Even if there were no regulatory restrictions on that, they just don't have a lot of people to go do it. So I think it's not surprising at all that cities and states that are dealing with this problem are feeling very frustrated. And I think Chicago, is one of the leaders that I know of that's trying to address this dysfunctional DC approach to the problem and do something on their own. So I think that is a very, very interesting development. I think I'll be very eager to see what that does over the next few years to the trafficking problems.
So just to talk about the drone issue again, this is actually, this comparison with the.
Why do I make you think of drones?
No, gun policing makes me think of drones. Like if you think of drones as being the most high-tech, this is what we need to do because that's what we do with counterterrorism, gun policing is like gumshoe 1920 policing, where they have to go through paper files in one centralized location, and where some gun dealers send their numbers in on toilet paper because that's all they're required to give written documents. And so when we talk about the disparity there, I think it's one of those things that, it's a good comparison to where some people want to go with some types of policing, when why don't we could invest the same effort and money into gun policing, where we don't have the even basic technology or capacity, but because of many of the restrictions, that Jens said. Had to get the drone thing. Wasn't you.
I may bring it up again, so watch out. So another here terrific question is that, or comment is that interventions can have both unintended positive or even negative effects. So this is a question for you, Toni, which is as you try to find the things that work, what are you doing to actually figure out whether or not some interventions, either through law enforcement or funded nonprofits, actually worsen gang problems or have negative consequences?
There's a great deal of research that's out there that isn't tapped into. I mean, one of the examples that we know here in Illinois that doesn't work is boot camp. And yet it is often used as a kind of population control device in the city, or in the state as well. So I will say that a lot of what we're tracking, what Frank Zemmering says in New York, that's leading to the reductions in terms of hotspot policing, we can also attribute to mentoring. And so this blueprints list that we have out now that talks about all of the different kinds of interventions that exist is also a kind of redlined list as well, because there isn't enough that we understand about what's going on in the community spaces for the people that don't bubble up to citywide or statewide or nationwide attention. And so one of the huge things that we're doing is really tracking what's already happening in these spaces and what the impact of it is, so that we can ultimately create a kind of continuous improvement process. That these are the adjustments that you should make in terms of dosage, that these are the key components that should drive what you do, et cetera, and that these things will be documented and help to just reshape what we think about how to go about violence prevention overall. I also want to add that the kinds of interventions that are going on that aren't identified are oftentimes things that people are saying qualitative or anecdotal, and that we're going to think about how to make use of qualitative and anecdotal information so that ultimately what communities do is driving and empowering themselves. We've got Jadine Chow here, who's been doing an amazing work with CPS and sort of thinking about safety around schools, et cetera. But when we engage the communities, ultimately we can find that they can become their own de facto safe passages, that they can be out on the streets themselves and be noting and mindful of what happens. So I'll say that let's keep track of what the communities are doing. Let's think about the qualitative piece as well as the quantitative piece. And let's promote that widely so that people don't fund what we know already doesn't work.
So let me just, for my final question, ask whether or not it would be appropriate as we, as a community, try to battle this, focus not so much solely on the homicide rate and the incidence of that, but really begin to have some metrics around violent injuries and things like that, because of the incredible ripple effect that has on families and communities as well. Because we may have a declining homicide rate, but if we have an incredible pool of violence in communities, we haven't really fixed the problem. Who'd like to speak to that?
Yes is the first answer, because I think exposure to community level violence is related to all sorts of bad things, and I don't need to go on there. Anxiety, depression, it actually gets in your brain and it lowers your kids' test scores, among all other sorts of things. The one word of caution I would say is that actually not all violence is alike. And I think as we start to think about holistic approaches, we also need to understand, just not like all cancers are alike, right? If you have testicular cancer, you go to one type of doctor. If you have breast cancer, you go to another doctor. Domestic violence, youth violence, gang violence, suicide, they have a lot of common causes, but it doesn't necessarily mean the interventions are the same. And I think one of the things that I struggle with in my own work, as well as I think everyone at this table is the difference between looking at long-term and short-term types of approaches. And when we think about public health approaches to violence, this means increasing things like overall health of a community, but it also means looking at very short-term, how do we save lives today? And those aren't always the same solutions. And I think it varies by the types of violence we're talking about. Domestic violence has a very particular structure. It's also not reported the same way. And in fact, in the networks I look at, those are the people that aren't in my networks, domestic violence. And it's one thing I think that it is absolutely to look at community health as a whole and to try to improve community health. But as we're doing that, we should not lose sight that each one of these aspects of violence is quite different. and requires probably different people in the discussion. You know, I don't know anything about suicide. So it's one of those things to be very, very careful about as we continue to frame in that discussion.
So
You know,
final-
I just want to quick add that there's a scoring mechanism called adverse childhood experiences. And for each adverse childhood experience, it can predict a certain kind of violent outcome. And one huge part of it is just witnessing violence in your home. And so it can be that one of your parents is abusing another parent, or that there's a fight that takes place outside. But all of those things contribute to a certain psychological condition in an individual, and that's the holistic piece that we're trying to treat. And then on the outcome piece, I think that connects to it, I just want to emphasize that we see highlighted in the community that it's overwhelmingly 17-year-old African-American males. And so a lot of what we're doing in terms of intervention now is thinking about, well, what did they look like when they were 14? What common characteristics did they have? And zero in on interventions that impact those, so that in 3 years we'll see fewer of those 17-year-old African-American males participating in the kinds of activities that always seem to make the newspapers.
So I'm so sorry we can't get to the rest of these questions. It's clear there's a sort of an incredibly untapped well of interest and concern and desire to be part of the solution. But join me in thanking the panel for a really informative conversation.